Amen. In the course of Christianity Explored that we've been going through, there's one of the sessions that begins with this picture of a film, an old projector. And it's got the film wheel on it, and it's spinning, and the narrator steps into the scene, and he says, imagine for the second, there's some public square, projected up on the wall is every scene of your entire life. Every thought, every motive, every deed on total display for all to see. And then he asks, how would you respond to that? I think it would be right, and I'll speak for you and say it would be humiliating for us, I think, if we're honest with ourselves. Yet it seems to me that we tend to walk around with the assumption that humanity's issue lies in the fact that we're just not very well known. I don't have people who understand me. My church doesn't understand me. My family doesn't understand me. My friends don't understand me. My boss doesn't understand me. We tend to, I hear at least, seems to me more often than not, we seem to suspect that humanity's real crisis is that they are not known well enough. And what we need most and want most is a deeper intimacy and connectivity. After all, isn't that what drives the obsession with social media? Texting is just one more way for us to stay connected. But I think what's helpful about the question, how would you respond if every detail of your life was on display? I think what's helpful about that question is it actually reveals a universal sense of hiding among us, a universal sense of shame. In other words, there's a universal sense and experience of not wanting to be known deep enough. That is to say, the universal problem among us is not that we are not known well enough, but that we are all desperately attempting to be known in a way that is not true to who we really are in our entirety. In fact, I would say that we spend way more time trying to shape our image to others than we do pursuing being known by others. And this is not new. This is started in the garden, right, with Adam and Eve. The eyes of both were opened after they first rebelled, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. In other words, after the fall, transparency, or the transparent life, became the condemned life. The issue was not that Adam and Eve were naked, but that their rebellion had introduced shame. And this shame drives all of us to alter how others perceive us because we know ultimately we stand unfit before our Creator as revealed in our constant need to hide our true selves from our neighbor. In researching intimacy and connection and hookup culture, Boston College professor Carrie Conan notes, as I started to really pay attention to what young adults were saying and doing in their hookups, dating, and relationships, I detected what I would call a low-level grinding despair. That's a despair of ever being truly known. In fact, during this lecture, one of a student that was listening to her raised her hand and said, that's great and all, but how amidst my partying and my hooking up can I avoid growing emotionally attached to those that I am with? In other words, it's just they've accepted and bought into the despair that there is no real intimacy, and so they want the sensation of connection without the reality. And this is not unique to that age group. We do not suffer then because we lack the ability to be known. I think one of the marks of our suffering is we despair of being known truly. Therefore, we settle for cheap substitutes. Social media gives us the chance to shape how people see us. Our accomplishments can be exalted and made so large in our life to the point of helping us avoid dealing with who we really are. Addiction to work and busyness helps us to escape ever having to face all of the other ways we have fallen short of the glory of God. Even church potlucks that are only filled with platitudes and shallow conversation can be used to fill in the void and never deal with the fact that apart from Christ, there is no hope. And so at the root is the fear that upon being known as we truly are, I think humanity has a sense in which we are too far from redemption. We hide because we don't like what we see, and we believe, whether we would say it this way or not, that we are too far from redemption. Just a few reflection questions. How are you doing at being known? How do you do at disclosing who you are to others? How often this week have you had to hide? Maybe you've hidden a thought or an action or an emotion. How often have you had to hold your tongue or to give a glance over your shoulder to avoid being caught in what you were about to do? How much energy have you had to exert this week to craft an image of you other than letting people see who you really are? Why do I start here? Today, our psalm is 139, and in its theme, I think David's central point is this: the eternal God intimately knows every creature, and there's a way in which that is good news. I think David's main point is that the eternal God knows intimately his creatures, and there's a way in which that is good news. So you'll see in our psalm that God both searches and knows his creatures. Look at verse 1. You have searched me and known me. Verse 2. You know when I sit down. Verse 3. You search out my path. Verse 6. Such knowledge is too wonderful to me. Jump all the way down to verse 23. Search me, O God, and know my heart. That theme bookends the psalm. The psalm is about David, who knows God, knows him perfectly. And so David then says, search me, know me, reveal every grievous way within me. He knows God knows him perfectly, and he delights in being known by God. A few details about the psalm. Since David wrote this, it was obviously written earlier in the life of Israel, prior to their being exiled. And so it would have been long before some of these other Psalms. Yet it has made it here into Book 5. And we know from the structure of the Psalms that we've looked at, Book 5 is looking after Israel's exile to the future kingdom. And I believe in its original setting, I think David has been running from someone. I think he's on the run. And the reason I think that is if you look at stanza 3, you'll see that's verses 13 to, I'm sorry, not verse 13. That's verses 19 to 22. You can see that David is angry at the wicked. Okay, so he's got some enemies in mind. And if you flip back over to verses 2 to 5, you'll note that this is David's confidence is that he's seeking assurance by knowing that God knows the details about him. In fact, in verse 2, it says God knows his path, his lying down. I'm looking at verse 3. Verse 2, you discern my thoughts from afar. So it seems that David is on the run. He's afar in some way. You'll see it again in verses 7 to 12. Verse 7 is introduced with a question. Where shall I go? I think David is in a place where it might have been thought unusual that maybe God could reach him there. So I think David is outside of Jerusalem. He is away from Israel. And so his question is, can the Lord reach me here? And the result is the reflection of verses 7 to 12. There's nowhere I can go that the Lord can reach me. So it seems to me that the situation in which David writes forced him at a distance to ask, is my condition unknown to God? Am I too far from him? And ultimately, is my situation unredeemable? And in his meditation, he penned this marvelous psalm to answer those questions. So we're going to look at 4 things this morning: the exactness of God's care, the edges of God's care, the evidence of God's care, and the enmity of God's care. So let's look at the exactness of God's care in verses 1 to 6. O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know when I sit down and when I rise up. You discern my thoughts from afar. You search out my path and my lying down and are acquainted with all my ways. Even before a word is on my tongue, behold, O Lord, you know it altogether. You hem me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful to me. It is high. I cannot attain it. So what comforts David? First, it's that God searches him and knows him. That word for search there is like one who excavates. So this isn't just kind of this is not an indifferent searching like you would enter into your computer to search for some file you misplaced years ago and you just hope the computer will do the work for you. This is saying God excavates his people. He searches deeply into the recesses of who we are and our lives. And David uses that to reflect on three things. Number one, God knows the details of David's life. The details. It's important to note that. The details. Look at what he says. God knows when David sits and when he rises. He discerns his thoughts from afar. He searches out my path, my lying down. And so God knows not simply the highlights, right? We would tend to think that if God were to keep track of us, he would probably keep track of the awards we won when we were younger or when we're older in work. Whatever it is, he would think he would focus on the highlights. But David wants to draw out that God's knowledge of David is in the details. When he sits down, when he rises up, when he's going to work, when he's laying down at night. God is intimately acquainted with all of David's ways. When he sits down, when he rises up, when he lies down. Secondly, God knows them even at a distance, as we've seen. God knows David's thoughts from afar, and he even knows his words before they enter onto David's tongue. God knows David better than David knows David. God knows you better than you know you. And that's something we need to hear from him so that when he gives us counsel, we understand he actually knows us better than we know us. Thirdly, God knows all this deliberately. Because this could be really bad news for David if God was putting David on trial. But within this first stanza, there is a purpose here. If you look in verses 5 to 6, what does God do with this knowledge? Well, you hem or hedge me in, behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. This is a deliberately careful knowledge. God takes this knowledge to do deliberate good to David. So God knows the details of David's life. God knows it from a distance, and God knows it to deliberately care for his people. It's not just an arbitrary knowledge in which God is neutral to. And that's why in verse 6 we see that this is not a terrible thing. There is a way in which this is good news for David. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. Now, I think it's important to note that this is not a self-absorbed joy. David is not thinking, wow, God is my biggest fan. I must be hot stuff for him to keep track of me. That's not the point. David is impressed with the largeness of God and the character of God and all of his bigness to still concern himself with the details. It doesn't leave David to think much of him. It leads David to look back and say, wow, God is so big, details so small, and God doesn't miss these. So such knowledge is too wonderful for him. This first stanza is teaching what we have called the doctrine of God's omniscience. It just means God is all-knowing. There's not a detail about reality that he misses, and that applies specifically to the lives of all of his creatures. He knows you. He knows you intimately. He knows all the details. And now, as I was thinking over this, it brought out the typical caricature of a teenager when you're having a spat at home, and you have that one spat where your teenager looks at you and just shouts, "You don't understand me." And what the psalmist is saying is, not a single creature can say this about God. You have never been in a situation in which God did not understand your situation or you more than you. He knows the details, and you'll never be able to point the finger and say you don't understand. And David is rejoicing. God knows the details of his people. So for application, I want to ask, are you satisfied in being known by God? Are you satisfied, and do you take comfort in that joy? Or, and here's where I really want to go with this, the tendency is to set someone else up as an idol to know you in that way. That maybe your spouse ought to know and understand you in order for you to be kind to them. Maybe a coworker must understand you perfectly and in order for you to want to serve them. Maybe your pastor or your church needs to provide a certain amount of authenticity for you in order to you to be faithful to that congregation. But friends, don't make a functional God out of people's knowledge of you. You are meant to find that in the Lord, who knows you perfectly. Are you satisfied that God knows you in that way? Now, it's not simply good news to know that God knows you. For what if God knows your circumstances but cannot reach you? It's one thing to be on the phone when you're in trouble and you're crying out for help. It's a whole other thing when those you're asking for help are right there with you. So that's where David moves. Verses 7 to 12. Where shall I go from your spirit? Or where shall I flee from your presence? If I ascend to heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I take to the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost part of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light be about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with you. So David moves from God's intimate knowledge of who he is, not only of his circumstance, but now David moves to God's presence, God's specific presence and availability to reach David exactly where he is. So David introduces this stanza with the question, where shall I go from your spirit? I think what David is doing is he's asking, am I too far from God in this situation? Because in the ancient Near East, gods were typically regional. Right? And so it was assumed that these gods functioned as little watchmen over their region of the land. Not so for Israel. Their God was over everything. And David draws that out. Says, where shall I go from your spirit? Answer, nowhere. There's nowhere David can go. What are the edges of God's attention? How do you get out from under his observation and the care that he gives to creation? There is no edge, is the point. The exactness of God's care for the universe has no end. It is over every aspect of the created order, including where David is when he wrote this. So where can he go? Verse 8, well, he can't go to the heavens, and he can't even go to the grave, which points to Christ, who would go to the grave to deliver us, right? Not even there, not even in sin, are you beyond God's care? Because Christ put on flesh to die a sinner's death, to defeat death, that you might live. Not even in the heavens or in the grave is David out of God's reach. But not only that, there's no length to which David could go to extend beyond God's reach. The wings of the morning and the uttermost part of the sea were phrases that reference the east and the west. The west would have been to, or the sea would have been to the west of Israel. And so not even to the east or to the west could David go far enough to find a place from which he was outside of God's care. So not in the heights or in the depths, not in the east or in the west, and lastly, not even in situations where human beings lose total sight, right? Verses 10 to 12. Even there your hand shall lead me, your right hand shall hold me, verses 11 and 12. Even if I say, surely the darkness shall cover me, and the light about me be night, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light to you. So for David, the most vulnerable scenario he could think of is trekking through the dark. Because you can't see who's out there, and because of that, as a result, other people could be watching you who mean you harm and could see you and could come act upon your vulnerability. And David says, not even there. Not even there. Why? Because the darkness is as light to the Lord. His sight is so clear. Now, when we first put these bulbs in and hit them on, I saw everyone's eyes, because it's so bright. It's like, whoa. And what David is saying is, if you look at the brightness of this room, This is the clarity with which God sees in the darkest of nights. It is so bright. God is not only all-knowing, he is ever-present and completely aware of every detail his people walk into. So David says, wherever he is, in this darkness and in this distance, he is not unknown and he is not unkept because of God's omniscience, his all-knowing, and his omnipresence, his all ever-present reality. There was a story in 2009, a man named John Jones entered a cave in Utah. He was seeking out a cave formation known as the Birth Canal due to how narrow it was, that it had been the reputation that it had. And he misidentified the location, and he descended into an even more narrow passage. And within minutes, John had discovered he could not move further in either direction. So stuck 400 feet into the cave, 100 feet below the earth's surface, he could not get himself out. They called in over 100 rescuers and 100 humans together trying to reach John. Spent 26 hours trying to get down to where he was, to get him out, attempting to rescue him to no avail. He eventually died of cardiac arrest because of the pressure. He was stuck upside down, and he eventually died. So the cave had lived up to its reputation. It was a place too difficult for man to descend and to rescue. And the point of David's meditation in these two stanzas is that cannot happen to God's people. You say, well, can't they still die? Yes. But the point is, there's not even death can separate you from the love that God has for you in Christ Jesus. That's what Paul's saying in Romans 8. There's no height nor depth nor anything that can separate us from the love of God. That John's descent into that cave can never be a parable for the good of God's people, because God knows intimately everything that's going on in the lives of his people, and he's ever present, and whenever he feels it, he will deliver his people, and it's guaranteed because God knows and he is there. You never have and you never will be out of God's sight or God's reach. Now, perhaps you're asking, well, what's the evidence of this? It's easy to say that. We've talked about the exactness of God's care. We've looked at the edges of it. But give us some evidence, David. Show us. How can we know this? I think sometimes we isolate the next stanza, which is there's some beautiful truths about the intricacy of God's attention to the detail of the human body and how he creates it. But the point of going to the mother's womb is because no human can go there. And so David wants to prove, how can I prove that I am accessible to God even in this distance and dark scenario? Let me go to the womb and show you if God can give detail and attention there, there's no place you can go in which he cannot give that same attention and detail. Let's read verses 13 to 18. For you formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you. For I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your books were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there were none of them. How precious to me are your thoughts, O God. How vast the sum of them. If I would count them, they are more than the sand. I awake, and I am still with you. Now, I want you to see that this third stanza completes the concern of verses 7 to 12. Verses 7 to 12 is asking, where can I go outside of God's reach? Well, look at the last verse, at verse 16. I'm sorry, look at, go a little further, to verse 18, the end of the stanza. If I would count them, that's God's thoughts, they are more than the sand. I awake, and look at the point he's trying to prove by the end of the stanza. I am still with you. So the burden of the third stanza about the womb is to prove the question of the second stanza. Where can I go to get away from you? And the third stanza's answer, nowhere. Wherever you are, God is with you. How do we prove that? We look at the womb. So David is proving God's presence with him in the darkness by going to the most mysterious place he can think of. For who in the ancient world understood or saw into the womb. Who could possibly fathom the marvelous system that worked to produce a human life? And that's why one of the greatest chances of preventing abortion today come when you provide sonogram machines to these ministries around the world. Because when somebody gets a sight of life being created into the womb, it tremendously increases the odds that they will not want to kill that child because they see the marvelous work that is going on into there. But to the ancient world, they had no idea what all was going on, simply that in some marvelous way, God was fastening the human body together. So how does David find confidence in this situation? By remembering how sophisticated human life is, and notice that the assembling of human life takes place beyond the reach of human hands, right? It takes place beyond the reach. No one is in there helping fascinate the child. It is outside of man's reach. Can David hope there? Yes. And there's a reason why when you get to 37 weeks and the mother wants to schedule that appointment and say, just get the baby out of me, there's a reason that doctors usually say no. We want the child in there as long as possible because the best place for your child to grow is in this wonderful, marvelous thing called the womb that the Lord himself has fastened. It's the best place for the developing child to be. So David says the Lord is actively involved with this process. While it may be secret to us, David says, my frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. And it's at that point God gave detail to David's life. So how can David trust even in the dark here? By drawing out the fact that in a place that no other humans can reach, God actively is involved with building humans there. And so we can, as a side point, make the point that a human's worth is not their viability. You'll hear that argument a lot, that a child should only be able to survive in as much as it is viable, right? In as much as it can self-sustain or in as much as it can support itself, whatever that is. But what this psalm teaches us is that by the active work of God to wove the child together in the womb, that the child's worth is tied to it even there because God cares about it. And that's why in verse 16, he draws out this point. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me. And David is not making an argument for predestination here, though I think you could make that point. I don't think that's the point of this text. I think the point is, what makes it into your calendar? What do you jot down into your schedule? Well, you jot down the things that are important to you. And so David's reflection upon this book in which David's days are written is the point at which the point in time in which they were written. While God was fastening David together in the womb, he already had David's days written on his book. So if God cares even there about the details David was talking about earlier, then David can take hope now that the Lord still is concerned and cares for him. That's what I think David is stating. Therefore, if God's care is so meticulous in the womb, which is a place far from the eyes and far from the presence of other people, then there is no depth or distance that you can walk into in which God's care is not active and present towards you. So the exactness of God's care, the edges of God's care, and are proven in the evidence of God's care. I'll say that again. The exactness of God's care, the edges of God's care are proven in the evidence of God's care. What is that evidence? Well, it's what happens in the womb. So let's stop for a moment and think about what all we got while we were in the womb. Did God not supply enough in the womb so that you could come out with a beating heart that would then oxygenate your limbs, which in this moment allow you to move and to grab things? Did he not supply to you in the womb with lungs to inhale and to exhale to receive that oxygen? Did God not form within you, while you were in the womb, the beginnings of a mind that would develop synapses so that all you have to do is think, and an impulse is sent down throughout your body and causes things to happen? Who gave you that? God. When did he give you that? In the womb. Did he not give you the capacity to discern the flavor of things through a complex and strange muscle called the tongue? Did he not give you vocal folds so that when you want to say something, they vibrate, and it vibrates at such a frequency that he gave you something else that can hear those vibrations, pick up the frequency, and now talking happens? You didn't give that to you. God gave that to you in the womb. Did he not give you rods and cones in your eyes such that when light like this blinds you and shines into your eyes, you can discern it, flip the image, and then this synapse-filled brain can comprehend what you're looking at? Where and when did God pay such vast, detailed attention to you such that you would have these things? In the womb. And if you have all of those things now, not perfectly, we're in a fallen world, so they break down. But if you see with what such care God equipped you for life in this world, you can know for sure he has not abandoned you now. And that's what David's saying. I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. And the one who gave that detail and cared in the womb still cares now. The exactness and the edges of his care are still true, as proven by that evidence. God's bigness is not a barrier to his care for his creatures. So now David then makes a strange move. How is it that we go from the exactness of care to the edges of his care to evidence of his care, and then suddenly to this, what seems to just be an outburst of wrath? Look at verses, I'll read 19 to the end. Oh, that you would slay the wicked, O God. O men of blood, depart from me. They speak against you with malicious intent. Your enemies take your name in vain. Do I not hate those who hate you, O Lord? And do I not loathe those who rise up against you? I hate them with complete hatred. I count them my enemies. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. And if there be any grievous way in me, or see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. What's the point of this transition? Some people have argued that this got added in later on, but I think it's consistent with the thought. I think it makes sense of what David is trying to do. I think before Christ, and even often as we're walking with Christ, we tend to have this view of God that God's righteous anger against us is unjust. You might say, what have I done? God, I'm neutral to the reality of God. I'm not angry at him. Why is he angry at me? The God of the Bible is just this belligerent, old, ancient deity who just is out to get somebody, it seems. But I think you have to see the connection between the previous stanzas to this last one. David has just argued, and I think it's true, God has given you everything we just described. Eyes, hands, ears, tongue, everything. Synapses in your brain. God has given literally all of that. In fact, you're still walking around in this moment. The only reason you're hearing me is because someone was merciful enough to give you all of these things. In the present, you have substantial evidence that there is one above you who cares about you. He has carried you from birth. He has supplied you with every need. He has been with you in every trial, has known every intimate detail about his creatures. He, in this moment, is still sustaining you that you would know better the grace that he has for you in Jesus Christ. And then with all of these things that he has given us outside of Christ, what do? We look at those things and shrug our shoulders and say, what evidence do I have that God cares? What evidence do I have? You use the evidence to speak against it. That's why Scripture says it's not an innocent neutrality. It's suppressing the truth about God. It's the choice amidst the evidence to say, I don't want him. And I'm going to rationalize it by saying, I don't see anything. And then you run after others to try to fill you while you're rejecting the one who has already given you everything. And you run after their love and their adoration when God has given you all of these things. And then you ask the question, how can God find fault with me? What have I done? And the real question is, in David's mind, how can he not find fault? How can you overlook this care? How can you overlook what God has done from the beginning to give you all of these things and act as if he hasn't proven his care for his creatures? And so David, as passionate as any of you would be, if the mother who nursed you was threatened, not that God's threatened here, but if somebody came after your mother or meant harm to her or spoke viciously of her, what would you say? You would say exactly what David says. I hate them for that. This God who cares for his creatures in every way, I loathe to see him treated that way by them. And so I think this stanza makes perfect sense. That in this dispensation, David, as the Lord's anointed, was passionate for the glory of God. And he despises those who would act like God is not all that he says he is, because God does care, and it enrages David. I think David's vengeance is totally fitting, because there is no greater offense than to run from the one who has made you with such care, who has been with you through every day, and who knows every detail about you. But now we need to set this psalm in its context. If you'll remember, we're in book 5 of the Psalms. And remember, in book 2, the very last psalm, Psalm 72, there is a note added to the end of that psalm by whoever compiled all the psalms together. And it says, the prayers of David, the son of Jesse, are ended. So the first David, and I think this is right, moves out of view after book 2. I think it's understood that we are now looking for the greater David, the son of David. And the reason I say that is in Psalm 132. Let me read this passage to you from Psalm 132. Same in book 5. It's part of this section of Psalms by David that we're looking at here. In Psalm 132, it says this: the Lord swore to David a sure oath from which he will not turn back. And then it quotes the promise. One of the sons of your body I will set on your throne. And so I think people are right in the last book of the Psalms to anticipate this being the second David speaking. This is the faithful Christ, written originally by David, now placed here to point to the trust and hope of the future Christ. And in this psalm, David's being exalted as the example of how to face suffering. This is a glimpse of what Christ would do on the cross. And as a result, he would come into the world and purchase for God a people. So I think this psalm is being used specifically to remind Israel of two things. Number one, this is put here because remember, Israel would have been in exile thinking of going back into the kingdom or into the land. And so they remember this time when David was away from the land. This initial psalm by David is being used as an example for Israel. Here's how you need to live as you wait, as David did. Remember, God cares. Remember, God sees. Remember, God's there with you. You are, and therefore, this is the second point, is that Israel, no matter the distance, whether they're under Assyria or under Babylon or under the Persians, whatever it is, no matter the distance of their exile and the depth of their rebellion, the reason David speaks here is that they could still count on God to deliver them. They had not been taken too far physically. They had not been taken too far spiritually. Did not God give just as much attention to Israel's formation, quote, in the womb, as he did to David? You remember Israel was not a nation, and God chose them and formed them and provided for them and carried them through the wilderness. And I think Israel is thinking back over all of these things and remembering even their assembling as a nation. And as they look at David, who has hope in the Lord through whatever his situation was, it speaks specifically to their return for exile. How should they respond in exile? Down at the bottom, verses 23 to 24. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. So here's the point. It is this God, the God of Psalm 139, who put himself in the womb in Advent, right? The Advent season is the celebration of Emmanuel, meaning God with us. God takes on flesh in the form of his Son, steps into the womb to save a people. And the point of the hope of Advent is that his people are not out of reach. That's why he will be the one who saves his people from their sin. You cannot get out of the slavery that you have been in, but Christ came to deliver you. And that's why Advent is such a big deal. Now, as I said, how are we to respond? Here's the point. Christ came knowing the rebellion of his people, right? He came knowing you as his enemies. We work so hard to put up an image to make us likable by people. We work so hard to convince people we are praiseworthy or we are something to be thought of, or just don't find anything wrong with me. You don't even have to find much right. Just don't find my errors. And what this psalm teaches us in light of Advent is that God knows the depth of your wickedness even more than you do. And light of Advent came anyway to purchase you. And as this psalm is telling Israel, you are not too far from God, I would say the same to you today. Turn from sin and trust in Christ. He came to purchase you, to pay for your sin, such that by faith in him, your sinfulness is crucified on him, placed on him, and his righteousness is placed on you. Now, how should we respond to those who believe and those who would turn towards him? Again, I'm going to read it one last time to make a final point. Verses 23 to 24. In light of this knowledge, David says, search me, O God, and know my heart. And here's the point. If you were to get a call from your doctor this afternoon, and they were to call and say, I've actually discovered you have a very rare form of cancer. There's only one doctor in the world who can remove this from you. What would you do? You would say to that doctor, sign me up. Send me to that part of the world where they're at, and whatever you have to do, do it. Deliver me from it. And that's what the knowledge of God, of your life, ought to call for from you. Because you have something far deadlier in you than cancer. You have sin, sickness, sinful rebellion that takes the great, glorious, holy God and attempts to pervert the truth about him. And because he is righteous, he must pour his wrath upon you. But in Christ, you have been delivered, all who believe. So turn from your sin and say to Christ, search me, O God, and know my heart. In other words, you can be known fully, and it's good news. You are known fully, and the only way that's good news is if you are in the Son. So by way of application, let Advent season not merely be about the celebrations and not merely the traditions, but about the transparent life of God's people who live transparent lives together. And we pursue the Lord together, saying, search me, O God, and know me. And if there is any grievous way in me, get it out. And together, Lord, lead us in the way everlasting. The true Advent life is not found in the ceremony. It's found in the realization that you are totally known. And so instead of living in hiding, you live an honest, transparent life with your brothers and sisters, that you guys might reveal your struggles together and trust the Lord to remove any grievous way from you. Let's be a transparent people this season and not hide, because Christ has already outed us. on the cross, if it takes the murder of the Son of God to fix us, you can't introduce something more shameful. And yet, the Lord knew how wicked we are and loved us even as his enemies. So let's celebrate Advent by being honest about how wicked we are, because we are really known and yet loved. Father, we thank you. And I pray this season that the coming of the Son would enlarge our hearts for your glory. It would enlarge our hearts for honesty amongst one another, and it would enlarge our hearts for confession to you. We know you see everything within us, and yet you provide our every need.